By winter, you'll have my son growing inside you. Those powerful words echoed across the weathered porch as the towering cowboy made his unexpected vow to the grief-stricken widow. The promise hung in the air between them, as heavy as the storm clouds gathering on the distant horizon. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The prairie wind howled through the lonely Dakota plains, chilling Maria Johnson to the bone as she swung her axe against stubborn oak. The rhythmic thud of metal against wood was her daily companion, a harsh melody that marks the passing of time since Thomas had been taken from her. 2 years of grief had left her hands calloused, her spirit hollow, and her home crumbling. But she refused to yield to the wilderness that seemed determined to reclaim what she and her husband had built together. Maria paused, resting the axe handle against her worn apron. The winter would be here soon, and her woodpile looked pitiful compared to what she needed. Thomas had always prepared for the cold months meticulously, stacking cords of split wood higher than she could reach. Now that responsibility fell to her alone, along with everything else: mending the leaking roof, tending the small vegetable garden, and keeping the predators away from her few remaining chickens. Her husband had perished in a snowstorm, his body found frozen just half a mile from their homestead. The memory still haunted her dreams: how close he had been to safety, how she had failed to hear his calls over the howling blizzard. Since that night, Maria had battled each sunrise alone, forcing herself to continue when giving up seemed the easier path. She wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Despite the chill in the air, the labor kept her warm, even as October's breath grew increasingly frigid across the Dakota Territory. As she reached for the axe again, something on the horizon caught her eye, a silhouette against the vast emptiness of the plains. A rider approached, unhurried but purposeful. As the figure drew closer, Maria felt her breath catch. The man sat tall in his saddle, his shoulders as wide as an oak beam, his presence commanding even at a distance. The locals spoke of him in hushed tones, a man who could break wild horses with just his voice, who had once carried a child through miles of snow when no one else would brave the storm. John Smith pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of her property. Even mounted, she could tell he stood taller than most men in the territory. His face was weathered by sun and wind, eyes sharp beneath the brim of his battered hat. Those eyes now studied her with an intensity that made Maria grip the axe handle tighter. Though whether for protection or support, she couldn't say. His name was John Smith, and the look in his eyes promised the kind of change Maria had stopped believing in. The kind that might either save her or break what little remained of her heart. John Smith dismounted with surprising grace for a man so large, removing his battered hat in a gesture of respect that seemed to belong to another era. His shadow stretched across the hard-packed dirt of the yard, reaching almost to Maria's feet where she stood, axe still in hand. "Mrs. Johnson," he greeted, his voice deep and steady, echoing across the barren yard. The sound carried weight, like distant thunder, promising rain to parched land. Maria's heart pounded against her ribs as she took in the full measure of him. Standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the Dakota sky, the cowboy was every bit as imposing on the ground as he had been on horseback. She'd heard stories about John Smith, whispered tales that traveled from homestead to homestead like wind through prairie grass. But seeing him in person made those stories seem pale and insufficient. "Mr. Smith," she acknowledged, forcing her voice not to waver. She set down her axe but kept it within reach, a habit born of 2 years facing the wilderness alone. His eyes, kind but assessing, moved from her face to the meager woodpile she'd been building, then to the sagging roof of her farmhouse where several shingles hung precariously, victims of the last storm. "You're preparing for winter," he observed, and there was no pity in his tone, only admiration. "That's good oak you're splitting. burns long through the cold nights. Maria bristled with a mixture of pride and fear, uncertain whether to feel complimented or exposed by his observations. The winter preparations were woefully behind schedule, something she was painfully aware of each time she looked at the calendar. "I manage," she replied, lifting her chin slightly. Her calloused hands told the story her words wouldn't, of endless labor, of stubbornness in the face of impossible odds, of a woman determined not to be defeated by grief or nature. The horse behind him snorted softly, pawing at the ground. John absently reached back to stroke its neck, his eyes never leaving Maria's face. "I don't doubt that for a moment, Mrs. Johnson," he said, and something in his voice made her believe he truly meant it. "But Dakota winters don't much care what we think we can handle." Maria swallowed hard, wondering what this mountain of a man intended. Folks didn't ride miles across open country for casual conversation, especially not men like John Smith. There was purpose in his visit. She could feel it hanging in the air between them, unspoken but present as the wind. "What brings you to my property, Mr. Smith?" she finally asked, deciding that directness was her only defense against the unsettling feelings spreading through her chest. John Smith's name had traveled through the Dakota Territory long before his imposing figure appeared on Maria Johnson's land. Around cookfires and in the general store, folks spoke of him with a reverence usually reserved for tall tales. They said he'd once carried a wounded child 20 miles through a howling blizzard, his broad shoulders bearing the weight without faltering. Others swore he could gentle the wildest horse with nothing but a whispered word and the steady gaze of his eyes. He built his cabin with his own 2 hands, Sarah Davis had told Maria over tea last spring, and finished it before most men would have laid the foundation. Such stories had seemed like comfort to Maria then, reassurance that good men still existed in a world that had taken her Thomas so cruelly. Now, with John standing in her yard, those legends collided with reality. The giant cowboy removed his hat, revealing sun-weathered skin and eyes that carried a depth of experience beyond their years. His hands, calloused from labor, held his battered hat with unexpected gentleness. The man before her was not the myth she'd heard whispered. He was flesh and blood, marked by the same Dakota winds that had carved lines into her own face. "The roof won't last another winter," he observed, glancing up at her farmhouse. His voice carried no judgment, only practical assessment. Maria straightened her spine, pride flaring. "I've managed this far." "That you have," he agreed, respect evident in his tone. "Not many could." A silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant cry of a hawk. Maria noticed how John's gaze occasionally drifted to the horizon, as if searching for something just beyond reach. Despite his impressive stature and reputation, loneliness had carved hollow spaces in him, just as it had in her. "I've seen you at church," he said finally, sitting with Sarah Davis and her husband. Maria nodded, wondering where this conversation was leading. The wind picked up, sending her apron fluttering against her worn dress. John took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as if preparing for something momentous. "Mrs. Johnson," he said quietly, his eyes never straying from hers, "I came to make you an offer." The directness of his gaze made Maria's heart quicken. This was no chance encounter, no neighborly visit. Whatever words would follow would change something between them, perhaps everything. Maria's breath caught as John spoke his vow, voice as plain as the prairie. "By winter, you'll have my son growing inside you." The words landed like a promise and a challenge, shattering the silence that loss had built around her. She recoiled, clutching her apron between trembling fingers. The rough cotton fabric, worn thin from years of use, offered little comfort against such bold proclamation. Maria Johnson had expected many things when this mountain of a man appeared at her doorstep. Perhaps an offer to chop wood or repair her sagging roof, but not this. Not a proposal so direct it stole the air from her lungs. She began, but words failed her. The ache of Thomas's memory pressed against her chest, familiar and heavy. 2 years had passed since the snowstorm took him, yet sometimes his absence felt as fresh as yesterday. She could still recall the exact timbre of his laugh, the gentle way he'd touch her cheek before heading out to tend the livestock. John stood motionless, his broad shoulders blocking the afternoon sun. Unlike most men who visited widows with intentions, he didn't shuffle his feet or hide behind flowery words. His directness was both terrifying and oddly refreshing. "You speak of children as if they're crops to be planted," Maria finally managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "A woman's body isn't farmland, Mr. Smith." The cowboy nodded, accepting her rebuke without offense. "I meant no disrespect," he replied. "Where I come from, plain speaking saves time and heartache." A sudden gust of wind swept across the yard, bending the tall prairie grass and carrying with it the scent of coming rain. Maria wrapped her arms around herself, feeling exposed in ways that had nothing to do with the weather. Could she ever open her heart to anyone again? The very thought of sharing her bed, her life, with someone who wasn't Thomas seemed like betrayal. Yet something in John's steady gaze spoke of reliability, of the kind of strength that wouldn't buckle under Dakota's harsh seasons. He wasn't offering romance or passion. He was offering survival, partnership, a chance to face the wilderness together rather than alone. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "I know enough," he answered simply. "I've watched you fight this land for months. You're stronger than most men I've met." Maria turned away, unable to bear the weight of his assessment. The question hanging between them wasn't whether she could accept this stranger as her husband, but whether she could imagine any future at all beyond the grief that had defined her existence for so long. John Smith didn't flinch at her hesitation. His weathered face remained steady, a stark contrast to the turmoil Maria felt churning inside her chest. The Dakota wind whistled through the gaps in her farmhouse walls, a constant reminder of the harsh winter that approached. "I'm not asking for your love, not at first," he said, his gaze unwavering as he stood in her modest kitchen. "I'm offering security, partnership, a chance to face the cold together, not alone." Maria Johnson turned away, her fingers tracing the worn edge of her apron. 2 years of solitude had taught her to guard what remained of her heart. Through the window, she could see the meager woodpile that wouldn't last through November, much less the brutal months that would follow. "And what happens when winter passes?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens if I can't?" She couldn't finish the thought. The tall cowboy took a careful step forward, respectful of her space yet determined to make his point. "Then we face spring together too," he answered simply. "This isn't just about a child, Mrs. Johnson. It's about survival." The practicality of his words warred with Maria's bruised heart. Thomas had been gone 2 years now, but his memory lingered in every corner of this home they'd built together. Could she trade those memories for a future? Could she accept a marriage born of survival, not romance? "I have neighbors who help," she countered, though they both knew the assistance was sporadic at best. John removed his battered hat, turning it slowly in his large hands. "Neighbors come and go. A husband stays." Maria caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror hanging by the door, a woman hollowed by grief and hardship, yet still standing. She thought of Sarah Davis, her closest friend, who had gently suggested months ago that life was for the living. "I don't know if I can be a proper wife," she admitted, the words catching in her throat. "I'm not asking for proper," John replied, "just willing." Outside, a horse nickered softly, as if adding its opinion to the conversation. The sound broke the tension, and Maria found herself almost smiling. "Would you give me time to consider?" she asked finally. The giant cowboy nodded, placing his hat back on his head. "I'll return in 3 days," he said, moving toward the door. "But remember, Maria, winter won't wait for either of us." As he mounted his horse and rode away, Maria stood in the doorway, watching his figure grow smaller against the vast Dakota landscape. Could she build something new from the ashes of her past? The question followed her like a shadow as she returned to her empty home. That night, Maria Johnson sat alone by the dim glow of her oil lamp, the prairie wind howling like a restless spirit outside her weathered farmhouse. She cradled Thomas's wedding ring in her palm, its once bright surface dulled by time and tears. The simple gold band caught what little light remained in the room, a small beacon from a life that no longer existed. "What would you have me do?" she whispered to the shadows, as if her late husband might somehow answer from beyond the veil. The window panes rattled violently against their frames, winter's early warning that mercy would be scarce in the months ahead. Maria closed her eyes, remembering how Thomas's love had felt, soft as spring rain, safe as a harbor, familiar as her own heartbeat. For 5 years they had built their life together, planning for children who never came, dreaming of prosperity that the harsh Dakota Territory had never quite delivered. Then the blizzard had taken him, leaving her with nothing but memories and a failing farm. John Smith's proposal echoed in her mind, practical and unadorned as the man himself. The tall cowboy hadn't offered poetry or passion, just protection, partnership, and purpose. His words carried the weight of iron, forged in the same loneliness she knew too well. "By winter, you'll have my son growing inside you." The boldness of his vow made her cheeks flush even now. Such directness should have offended her, yet there was something refreshingly honest in his approach. No false promises, no hidden expectations, just the raw truth of what he wanted and what he offered in return. Maria placed the ring on her rough, work-worn finger, surprised by how loose it had become. Grief had whittled her down to essentials, just as it had stripped her home of comfort and security. The widow glanced around at her meager possessions, the patched quilt, the dwindling firewood, the empty pantry shelves that would remain bare without intervention. John's offer promised something entirely different from what she'd known with Thomas. Strength instead of tenderness, certainty instead of dreams, pragmatism instead of passion. And most compelling of all, the possibility of new life growing within her. A child to love, a reason to continue when everything else seemed futile. Outside, a particularly fierce gust shook the entire structure, sending a shower of dust from the ceiling beams. Winter was coming, relentless and indifferent to her solitude. Soon the snow would pile against her door, and the nights would stretch endlessly. Would she face them alone again, clinging to memories that couldn't keep her warm? Maria closed her fingers around Thomas's ring and pressed it to her heart. By morning, she would need an answer. 3 days passed in a blur of routine for Maria Johnson. Each dawn she rose with the prairie sun, trying to lose herself in the familiar rhythm of chores, feeding chickens, mending fences, patching the roof that threatened to give way before winter's first snow. Yet no matter how she busied her hands, her mind returned to John Smith's proposal, his deep voice echoing in her thoughts like thunder across the plains. "By winter, you'll have my son growing inside you." The words followed her from sunrise to sunset, both terrifying and oddly comforting in their certainty. On the 4th morning, as Maria stepped onto her porch with coffee cup in hand, she nearly dropped it at the sight of the giant cowboy waiting silently by the railing. John removed his battered hat in greeting, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it, though no one else lived for miles. Maria clutched her shawl tighter. "I wasn't expecting company." John nodded, understanding her unspoken hesitation. From his pocket, he withdrew an object that caught the morning light, a tarnished pocket watch, its silver case worn smooth in places from years of handling. "My grandfather carried this across an ocean," he explained, opening the case to reveal the timepiece still ticking steadily. "He left Ireland during the famine with nothing but this watch and the clothes on his back." Maria found herself stepping closer. drawn by the quiet intensity in his eyes. My grandmother joined him a year later. They built a life from nothing but hope and hard work, John continued, his large fingers surprisingly gentle as they traced the watch's edge. He told me something I've never forgotten, that every moment matters, especially those that determine your future. The wind swept across the yard, carrying the scent of coming rain. Maria watched how carefully the tall man held the family heirloom, recognizing it as the gesture it was, a sharing of something precious, a glimpse into what mattered to him. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man," she offered, her voice softer than she intended. "He was," John agreed, closing the watch with a soft click. "He also said that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about making choices even when you're terrified." Their eyes met, and Maria understood he wasn't just telling a family story. He was acknowledging her fear without diminishing it, offering understanding without pressing for an answer. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said simply, replacing his hat. "If you'd like to talk more." As he mounted his horse and rode away, Maria remained on the porch long after his figure disappeared into the horizon, the memory of the steadily ticking watch keeping time with her thoughts. John's words hung in the crisp Dakota air, carrying more weight than any promise Maria Johnson had heard since Thomas's death. The pocket watch in his large, calloused hand caught the morning light, a family heirloom that had survived generations of hardship. "You think I'm that woman?" she asked, her voice trembling like autumn leaves clinging to their branches. The question wasn't just about bearing children. It was about whether she could truly be a partner to this mountain of a man who had appeared on her doorstep with an offer that defied convention. John tucked the timepiece away carefully, his movements deliberate. His weathered face softened as he looked at her, not with pity, but with something far more dangerous: respect. "You fight for what's yours, even when the odds are against you," he said, gesturing toward her modest homestead. "That's all I've ever wanted in a partner." Maria's gaze followed his hand, taking in the property she'd struggled to maintain since becoming a widow. The sagging roof she'd patched herself, the garden that had fed her through 2 lonely summers, the chopping block where she'd split enough wood to keep herself from freezing during the bitter Dakota nights. "I've watched you," the cowboy continued, his deep voice gentle. "Not in a way that's improper, but enough to know your character. The way you help Sarah Davis when her youngest falls ill. How you still bring flowers to the church, even when your own table is bare." A flush crept up Maria's neck. She hadn't realized anyone had noticed these small acts, least of all this quiet giant of a man who rarely came to town except for supplies. For the first time in years, Maria considered the possibility that she could build something new, even if it meant letting go of the past. The ring on her finger, Thomas's ring, suddenly felt heavy. Not because she was betraying a memory, but because perhaps she was finally honoring it by choosing to live again. "I can't promise to love you right away," she said, her words barely audible above the prairie wind. John nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'm not asking for what isn't yours to give yet. Just the chance to build something together that winter can't tear down." Maria looked toward the horizon, where storm clouds gathered in the distance. Another winter was coming, and with it, the crushing loneliness she'd come to dread. Perhaps John Smith's proposal wasn't just about survival or children. Perhaps it was about finding strength in partnership that neither could find alone. Maria Johnson sat on the worn wooden steps of her porch, watching the sunset paint the Dakota sky in fiery hues. The question had been burning inside her since John's proposal, and she could no longer keep it contained. "What if I can't give you children?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the prairie wind. "What is my body?" She gestured to herself, to the frame that had grown thinner with grief and harder with labor. "What if it's too worn to carry the legacy you want?" John Smith removed his battered hat and settled beside her, his massive frame making the step creak beneath them. Unlike many men who might have dismissed such fears, he considered her words carefully. "My grandmother couldn't conceive for 7 years," he said, pulling the pocket watch from his vest. He opened it, revealing a faded photograph inside. "Then she had my father, and after him, 3 more children." Maria studied the timepiece, this tangible piece of his history. "That doesn't mean I'll be so fortunate." "No," John agreed, his honesty refreshing. "It doesn't, but it means we don't know what tomorrow brings." He closed the watch with a gentle click. "We'll face that together, like married folk do." The cowboy turned to look at her directly, his eyes reflecting the dying sun. "I believe your heart is already a mother's. Your body will follow." Maria felt her throat tighten. No one had spoken to her with such certainty since Thomas died. John's confidence was both terrifying and comforting, a contradiction that seemed to define everything about this unusual arrangement. "And if it doesn't," she pressed, needing to hear the answer, "then we'll build our family another way," he said simply. "There are children who need homes. There are ways to leave legacies beyond blood." A flock of birds passed overhead, heading south for the coming winter. Maria watched them, envying their certainty of purpose. "You make it sound so simple," she whispered. "Not simple," John corrected. "Just possible." He stood, towering above her. "Nothing worth having comes easy, Maria, but that doesn't mean it isn't worth fighting for." As he walked toward his horse, Maria found herself longing to believe him, to trust that her body, which had survived 2 years of solitary struggle, might still nurture new life. The thought was like a small flame in the growing darkness, fragile but persistent. That night, as she lay awake listening to the wind, Maria realized something had shifted inside her. Fear remained, but alongside it grew something she hadn't felt in years: hope. After 7 days of restless nights and prayer, Maria Johnson made her decision. The morning air carried the scent of pine as she walked to the edge of town where John Smith waited, his imposing figure silhouetted against the Dakota sky. His horse grazed nearby, seemingly as patient as its master. "1 week from today," she declared, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "But I keep my name until after the ceremony, and I keep my house for now." The words felt strange on her tongue, part surrender, part negotiation. John removed his battered hat, holding it respectfully against his chest. Relief washed over his weathered features, softening the lines around his eyes. "I understand," he replied, nodding solemnly. "Your terms are fair." The tall cowboy didn't rush to embrace her or seal their agreement with anything more than his word. Instead, he stood respectfully at a distance, giving Maria the space her heart still needed. This restraint, this understanding of her fragility, made her wonder if perhaps she had chosen wisely after all. "You'll find my home more comfortable than this, especially once winter sets in," he promised, gesturing vaguely toward the foothills where his log house stood. The south-facing windows catch the sun all day. Even in January, the main room stays warm. Maria nodded, trying to picture herself in this stranger's home, sharing his table, his hearth, eventually his bed. The thought sent a flush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the morning chill. "I'll speak with the minister today," John continued, his deep voice gentle but matter-of-fact, "unless you'd prefer to handle those arrangements." "No," Maria replied quickly. "You can speak with him." One less burden for her shoulders to bear. For a moment, they stood in awkward silence, 2 people preparing to bind their lives together without the comfort of love to ease the way. Yet there was something honest in their arrangement that Maria found oddly comforting. "I should get back," she said finally, gesturing toward town. "Sarah Davis is expecting me for tea." John nodded, replacing his hat. "I'll walk you partway." As they moved side by side down the dusty road, Maria felt something unfamiliar stirring within her. Not passion or even affection, but possibility. For the first time since Thomas had been taken by the merciless winter, she dared to imagine a future where she was not alone, where the howling prairie winds couldn't reach her heart. A future with a chance for new life. The preparations for the wedding unfolded with practical swiftness, much like everything else on the Dakota frontier. Maria Johnson spent the days leading up to the ceremony sorting through her meager possessions, deciding what would accompany her to John's more substantial home and what would remain behind, perhaps forever. Sarah Davis arrived early on the morning before the wedding, her arms laden with freshly baked bread and a small jar of preserved wildflowers. The two women had weathered countless hardships together since arriving in the territory, and Sarah's steady presence had been Maria's anchor through the darkest days after Thomas's death. "Let me help you with that," Sarah offered, taking a stack of worn linens from Maria's hands. Her eyes, warm and concerned, studied her friend's face. "Are you certain about this, Maria? It's all happening so quickly." Maria paused, her fingers tracing the edge of a quilt she'd sewn during her first year of marriage. "I'd rather risk a new life than face another winter alone," she said quietly. "John is a good man, not like Thomas, but—" Her voice trailed off as she folded the quilt with practiced hands. "Different isn't always worse," Sarah reminded her, placing the linens in a wooden chunk. "Robert says John Smith has never broken his word to anyone. That counts for something out here." As they worked, memories surfaced with each item they packed. A chipped teacup prompted stories of summer gatherings. A faded photograph unleashed tears that turned to unexpected laughter. The women moved through the small farmhouse, their conversation flowing between practical concerns and deeper fears. "What if I can't love him?" Maria whispered, clutching a small book of poems Thomas had given her years ago. Sarah's hands stilled over the trunk. "Perhaps that's not the question," she said thoughtfully. "Perhaps it's whether you can build something worth having, even if it begins differently than before." By dusk, Maria's life had been sorted into 3 categories: what would go, what would stay, and what would be given away. The physical task complete, she and Sarah sat on the porch steps, watching the prairie sky turn crimson. "Tomorrow, you'll be Mrs. Smith," Sarah said, squeezing Maria's hand. Maria shook her head. "No, I'll still be Maria Johnson until after the ceremony. That was part of our agreement." Sarah smiled at this evidence of her friend's enduring spirit. "Then I'll treasure these last hours with Maria Johnson and look forward to knowing the woman you'll become next." As darkness fell, the two friends embraced, both knowing that whatever came next would be faced with the same resilience that had carried them through everything before. The small church stood as a beacon of community in the Dakota Territory, its wooden pews filled to capacity on this crisp autumn morning. Maria Johnson felt every gaze upon her as she paused at the entrance, her simple blue dress, the best she owned, fluttering slightly in the draft. Sarah Davis squeezed her arm reassuringly, her presence a silent affirmation that Maria wasn't alone in this momentous step. "Ready?" Sarah whispered, her eyes reflecting both concern and support. Maria nodded, unable to form words as she surveyed the gathering. Neighbors who had watched her struggle through 2 years of widowhood now witnessed her choosing life again. Some faces showed genuine happiness, others barely concealed curiosity about this hasty union. Everyone knew what drove this marriage: survival, practicality, the harsh reality of frontier life. At the altar stood John Smith, his imposing frame somehow softened by the occasion. He'd traded his weathered work clothes for a clean shirt and dark trousers, though he still looked more at home on horseback than in a church. His hat was respectfully absent, revealing hair tamed with water and effort. When his eyes found Maria's, the steadiness in his gaze anchored her wavering courage. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath Maria's feet as Sarah guided her forward. Each step carried her away from Thomas's memory and toward an uncertain future with this man who had appeared like a force of nature on her doorstep. The minister, a circuit preacher who visited the settlement monthly, spoke of duty, partnership, and God's blessing upon unions founded on respect. His words were practical rather than romantic, fitting for a marriage born of necessity. Maria barely heard them, focused instead on the warmth of John's calloused hand as it enveloped hers. When the time came for rings, John produced a silver band, its surface catching the light, streaming through the church's small windows. "Made it myself," he murmured, just loud enough for Maria to hear. "Silver from my mother's brooch." As he slipped the handcrafted ring onto her finger, Maria felt something unexpected, a lightness, as if the weight she'd carried since Thomas's death had shifted, making room for something new. Not happiness, not yet, but possibility. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, his voice echoing in the hushed church. John's kiss was gentle, respectful, the kiss of a man who understood that trust must be earned. As they turned to face the congregation, Maria caught Sarah wiping a tear, and several women nodding approvingly. They walked out into the autumn sunlight as husband and wife, greeted by well-wishers and the ringing of the church bell. The sound seemed to mark not just their union, but a boundary between what had been and what might be. A new beginning forged in practicality, but perhaps, someday, to be sustained by something deeper. The floorboards creaked beneath Maria Johnson's feet as she moved about John's cabin, now their shared home. Night had fallen, bringing with it a chill that seeped through the log walls, despite the crackling fire. She ran her fingers along the rough-hewn table, feeling every groove and knot, so different from the smooth surfaces of her former home, yet somehow comforting in their solidity. John entered carrying an armload of firewood, his tall frame ducking slightly beneath the doorway. The wedding band on his finger caught the firelight, still unfamiliar against his weathered skin. "The temperature's dropping," he said, arranging the logs carefully. "First real cold of the season." Maria nodded, twisting her own ring nervously. The weight of their new reality pressed down on her shoulders. This was their first night as husband and wife, in this house that was now meant to be her home. "I'm afraid," she whispered finally, the words escaping before she could contain them. John straightened, concern etching his features. "Of what?" "Of disappointing you." Maria's voice trembled. "What if I can't be the wife you need? What if I can't give you the family you want?" She gestured helplessly around the cabin. "I don't even know how to make this place feel like ours yet." The tall cowboy crossed the room in 3 strides, then surprised her by kneeling at her feet, bringing his eyes level with hers. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight. "Listen to me," he said, his deep voice soft yet steady. "I married you for your strength, not your perfection." He took her calloused hands in his larger ones. "I've watched you face loss that would break most people. Yet you wake each morning and fight on." Maria blinked back tears. "But a marriage needs more than survival." "It does," John agreed. "Respect, partnership, trust, that's what matters." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "Passion can grow if we nurture it together, like anything worth having on this frontier." The lamp flickered, casting long shadows across the walls as Maria absorbed his words. For 2 years, she'd carried grief like a stone in her chest, never imagining it could make room for anything else. "I'm not asking you to forget Thomas," John continued, seeming to read her thoughts. "Just to believe we can build something new in our own time." Maria nodded slowly, feeling something loosen within her, not the breaking of her past, but the gentle unfurling of possibility. She placed her hand against John's cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers. "I think I can do that," she whispered, and for the first time since her wedding vows, she truly believed it. The first week in John Smith's home felt like learning a new dance without knowing the steps. Maria Johnson moved cautiously through the log cabin, noting the bachelor simplicity, sparse furnishings, practical tools hanging from pegs, and the lingering scent of leather and pine. Each morning, she woke before dawn, listening to her husband's steady breathing before slipping quietly from bed to start the day. John rose with the sun, his large frame casting long shadows across the wooden floor as he prepared for work. He'd nod appreciatively at the hot coffee waiting on the table, their conversations still measured and careful. Outside, he threw himself into labor with unwavering dedication, mending fences and tending livestock with hands that never seemed to tire. Maria found purpose in transforming the bachelor quarters. She hung curtains she'd mended from old fabric, arranged wildflowers in tin cans, and swept away years of solitary living from the corners. The kitchen became her domain, where she experimented with limited supplies to create meals that brought a quiet smile to John's weathered face. "My mother made bread like this," he remarked one evening, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. His voice carried no sadness, only fond remembrance as he described his childhood on another homestead far to the east. That night marked a turning point. Maria shared stories of her own family, immigrants who had crossed an ocean with nothing but hope. John listened intently, his eyes reflecting the lamplight as she spoke of dreams long buried beneath grief and survival. Their evenings by the hearth became a sanctuary. While wind whistled through the Dakota plains outside, they exchanged pieces of themselves. John's adventures breaking horses for wealthy ranchers, Maria's memories of Thomas without the sharp edge of pain that once accompanied them. "I never thought silence could be comfortable," Maria admitted one night as they sat side by side, darning socks by firelight. "With Thomas, we always filled the quiet with chatter." John nodded, his large hands surprisingly deft with needle and thread. "Different doesn't mean lesser," he replied, wisdom in his simplicity. When Sarah Davis visited 3 weeks after the wedding, she noticed the change immediately. "You look settled," she whispered to Maria as they prepared lunch together. "Not just resigned, at peace." Maria couldn't deny it. The partnership she and John had forged wasn't built on passion or desperate romance, but on something equally valuable: mutual respect that deepened with each passing day. His steady presence gave her strength. Her resilience earned his admiration. Each small victory, a successful meal, a repaired roof, a moment of shared laughter, built a foundation stronger than either had anticipated. Not the love of fairy tales, perhaps, but something real and enduring, growing quietly between them like prairie wildflowers after rain. The fragile peace Maria and John had built was shattered one frosty morning in late autumn. Maria had just finished hanging the freshly washed linens to dry in the brisk air when she spotted a lone rider approaching their homestead. As the figure drew closer, she recognized Samuel Brown, the town banker, his normally composed face etched with concern. "Mrs. Smith," Samuel greeted her formally, though Maria still felt a jolt at hearing her new surname. John emerged from the barn, wiping his calloused hands on his trousers as he approached. "Mr. Brown," John acknowledged with a respectful nod. "What brings you all this way?" The banker dismounted, clutching a worn leather portfolio. "I'm afraid I come with troubling news." His eyes darted between them. "There's a matter of an outstanding debt in Thomas Johnson's name." Maria felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Thomas kept meticulous records." Inside their home, Samuel spread several documents across the oak table John had crafted. The figures on the yellowed paper made Maria's stomach twist into knots. According to the banker, Thomas had taken a substantial loan just months before his death, money that had never been repaid. $500, John murmured, his deep voice unusually strained. It was an astronomical sum for frontier folk like them. Maria's hands trembled as she stared at the signature at the bottom of the loan agreement. It looked like Thomas's handwriting, yet something felt wrong. "I don't understand," she said. "He never mentioned this." Samuel cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The bank has been patient, but I'm afraid we can no longer delay collection. You have 30 days to settle the debt, or—" He didn't need to finish. They all knew what would happen. After the banker departed, Maria collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands. All our cattle wouldn't fetch half that amount, she said, despair washing over her. And with winter coming, John stood by the window, his broad shoulders tense as he gazed out at the land they'd worked so hard to improve, the home they'd transformed together, the future they'd carefully begun to nurture. "This land has been in my family for 2 generations," he said quietly. "But it's just soil and timber. What matters is us." Maria looked up at him, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I've brought nothing but trouble to your doorstep. First a wife who couldn't give you a child right away, and now this." John crossed the room in 3 long strides, kneeling before her. "Listen to me," he said, taking her hands in his. "We'll find a way. Together." But as darkness fell across the Dakota plains, both wondered silently if their newfound happiness had been too fragile to withstand such a devastating blow. Maria Johnson sat at the edge of their bed, her shoulders slumped under the weight of Samuel Brown's news. Tears streamed down her weathered face as she twisted Thomas's ring between her fingers, a habit she developed whenever anxiety overwhelmed her. "I've brought nothing but ruin to your life," she wept, her voice breaking. "First my failing farm, and now this debt that threatens everything you've worked for." The guilt crushed her chest, making each breath painful. "Perhaps you'd have been better off without me." John crossed the room in 2 long strides, his tall frame casting a protective shadow as he knelt before her. His calloused hands, rough from years of working the land, gently covered hers. "This house is just wood and stone," he said, his deep voice strong and calm despite the crisis they faced. His eyes, steady as the Dakota horizon, held hers without wavering. "What matters is us, together. We'll sell the cattle, start over if we must." Maria shook her head, unconvinced. "But your family has owned this land for—" "Land can be found again," John interrupted, squeezing her hands. "I meant what I vowed, for better or worse." He reached up to brush a tear from her cheek. "I didn't marry you because life would be easy. I married you because I knew we'd be stronger facing life storms together." The cowboy stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the cattle grazing in the distance, livestock that represented years of careful breeding and hard work. Yet he spoke of selling them without hesitation, his broad shoulders squared with resolve rather than defeat. "My father rebuilt 3 times after floods took everything," he continued. "My mother never once blamed the river. They faced each setback as one, just as we will." Maria rose from the bed, drawn to his steadfastness like a beacon in darkness. "But what if—" "No what ifs," John said firmly. "Tomorrow we'll ride into town together. We'll speak with Robert. He knows banking matters better than most. There might be options we haven't considered." His unwavering confidence slowly rekindled Maria's courage. She stepped beside him at the window, her arm brushing against his. The simple contact grounded her, reminding her that she was no longer facing life's hardships alone. "Together, then," she whispered, her voice finding strength. She slipped her late husband's ring into her pocket, not forgetting the past, but choosing to face forward. John nodded, placing his arm around her shoulders. "Together," he affirmed. "That's how true partnerships face hardship, as one." The whispers began at the general store, where Robert Davis had been examining the bank's public notices. His keen eye, honed from years as the town's unofficial record keeper, spotted discrepancies in the handwriting on Thomas Johnson's supposed signature. That evening, he shared his suspicions with Sarah, who immediately thought of Maria and John. "The dates don't align," Robert explained when they gathered around John and Maria's kitchen table the following day. "Thomas couldn't have signed this document in June. He was helping build the new schoolhouse then." His finger traced the suspicious signature while Maria stared, her throat tight with emotion. John placed his weathered hand over hers. "We need proof, not just doubts," he said, his voice steady despite the stakes. Word spread quickly through the close-knit community. Farmers who had traded with Thomas came forward with ledgers showing his whereabouts. The widow Peterson revealed she'd faced similar claims months earlier, but had sold her last cow to settle the debt, fearing legal troubles. Sarah organized the women to gather evidence, while their husbands spoke with Territorial Marshal Williams, who had ridden in from the county seat. The marshal, a man with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing, reviewed the documents with growing concern. "This appears to be the work of James Harrington," the marshal declared after 3 days of investigation. "He's been working his way through the territory, targeting widows and those without means to fight back." When confronted at the bank, Samuel Brown appeared genuinely shocked. "I only processed what came across my desk," the banker insisted, face pale with dismay. "I never thought to question the authenticity." The marshal arrested Harrington at the saloon 2 towns over, finding forged documents from 5 other victims in his possession. The swindler had counted on grief and isolation to silence his targets. He hadn't accounted for a community that protected its own. When the debt was officially erased, Maria collapsed into John's arms, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered against his chest. "Everything Thomas built, everything we've made together, it's safe now." That night, neighbors gathered at their home, bringing food and relief. Maria watched as John thanked them all, his imposing figure somehow gentler now, more at ease. She realized something had shifted between them. The threat had forced them to fight not just for their home, but for their shared future. Later, as moonlight spilled through their bedroom window, Maria traced the lines of John's face. "I never thought I'd find this again," she admitted softly. "Find what?" he asked, drawing her closer. "A partner who stands beside me, not just in good times, but in the darkest moments too." The bond between them, forged in adversity and tempered by shared purpose, had grown stronger than either had dared to hope. The Dakota winter released its icy grip as March winds gave way to April's gentler breath. Maria Johnson stood at the window of the log home she now shared with John, watching as patches of earth emerged from beneath melting snow. The fears that had haunted her since accepting his proposal, fears of inadequacy, of failure, of never truly healing, seemed to be thawing alongside the frozen ground. 6 months had passed since their wedding day. 6 months of shared meals, quiet conversations by the fire, and nights where comfort gradually replaced awkwardness. Yet Maria's belly remained flat, showing no signs of the child John had once vowed she would carry. "You're thinking too hard again," John said, his large frame filling the doorway as he removed his mud-caked boots. His voice held no accusation, only the steady patience that had become her anchor. "The snow's nearly gone," she replied, avoiding his gentle observation. That evening, as they sat side by side mending tools and clothing, Maria studied her husband's hands, strong yet careful as they worked leather straps. Those same hands had rebuilt her faith in possibility, one small kindness at a time. "Sarah invited us for Sunday dinner," Maria mentioned, thinking of her loyal friend who had stood beside her through doubt and decision. "Robert's caught some fish from the creek." John nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "We should bring something, maybe those preserves you put up last fall." The casual domesticity of their exchange struck Maria suddenly. How natural it felt. How right. His eyes fell to her hand, to the ring that now circled her finger. "I love you," Maria whispered, the words no longer trapped behind grief and fear. "Not because I should, but because I do." John's weathered face transformed, joy breaking across it like sunrise. He gathered her in his arms, and in that embrace, partnership blossomed into something Maria had once believed lost forever. True devotion, freely given. The first flutter came as Maria Johnson stood in the garden, her hands buried in the rich Dakota soil. At first, she thought it was merely nerves or excitement from the morning's work. But when it came again, a gentle ripple like a whisper from within, she knew. After months of waiting, of hoping, of wondering if John's vow would ever come true, life had begun to stir inside her. She pressed her soil-stained hands against her apron, tears welling in her eyes. The summer breeze carried the scent of wildflowers across the land they'd fought so hard to keep. Maria waited until evening, when John returned from mending fences on the northern boundary of their property. "I have something to tell you," she said, taking his weathered hand and leading him to the oak tree that stood sentinel over their home. The setting sun painted the Dakota sky in magnificent shades of orange and purple, a fitting backdrop for her news. When she told him, John's stoic expression crumbled. The tall cowboy fell to his knees before her, pressing his ear gently against her still flat belly, as if he might hear the tiny heartbeat within. His shoulders shook with silent emotion. "You've made me the happiest man in the territory," he whispered, his voice thick with feeling. Word spread quickly through their small community. Sarah Davis was the first to arrive, bringing a basket of carefully preserved baby clothes she'd been saving for this very moment. "I told you," she said. Curtains that had been sewn to keep out the cold now fluttered in summer breezes, seeming to dance with joy. The hearth that had provided necessary warmth now radiated with the promise of family gatherings and stories to be told. As neighbors gathered on their porch one evening, bringing food and good wishes, Maria caught John's eye across the crowded room. In his steady gaze, she found everything she'd once thought lost forever: security, partnership, and a love that had grown not from desperate necessity, but from shared strength and tender perseverance. The first snowfall of winter dusted the Dakota plains as Maria Johnson cradled her newborn son in her arms, his tiny fingers wrapped around hers with surprising strength. She gazed down at him, this miracle they had created not from desperation, but from love that had grown slowly, steadily, like prairie grass after rain. The child had arrived 9 months after that spring morning, when she had finally spoken the words her heart had held captive for so long. "He has your eyes," she whispered to John, who stood beside the bed, his imposing frame somehow softened as he looked upon his family. "And your spirit," he replied, gently touching the infant's cheek. "Strong already." Outside their log home, the wind that had once seemed so threatening now merely sang lullabies against the sturdy walls. The cradle where their son slept had been lovingly crafted by John's hands, each piece of wood sanded smooth, each joint fitted with care and patience, much like the relationship they had built together. Sarah Davis visited often, bringing small gifts and wisdom from her own years as a mother. "I knew you would find happiness again," she told Maria one afternoon as they watched the baby sleep, "even when you couldn't see it yourself." The community that had rallied around them during the banking scandal now celebrated their joy. Even Samuel Brown, who had once brought such troubling news about Thomas's supposed debt, tipped his hat respectfully when he passed John in town. Maria sometimes found herself thinking of Thomas, not with the sharp pain that had once accompanied his memory, but with a quiet gratitude for the life they had shared. She kept his ring in a small box beside their bed, a reminder of a chapter closed but not forgotten. The cattle that had nearly been sold to pay the fraudulent debt now grazed peacefully on land that stretched toward the horizon. Robert, Sarah's husband, had become a trusted friend, often stopping by to discuss plans for spring planting or to share news from town. As winter deepened, Maria and John spent evenings by the fire, planning for their son's future. The pocket watch that had belonged to John's ancestors now rested on the mantel, marking time not as something to fear, but as a promise of days to come. "I made you a vow," John said one night, his voice low as their son slept between them. "But you gave me so much more than I asked for." Maria smiled, remembering the giant cowboy who had appeared like a legend on her doorstep. "We built this together," she said, taking his weathered hand in hers. "One day at a time." In the cradle John had built, Their child dreamed, surrounded by the legacy of two hearts that had found in each other not just survival, but a love that would endure long after the prairie winds faded into memory.